All right, I call to order the August 16th Budget Finance and Growth Committee meeting. As we do at each meeting, it's been a couple months since we had. We just go through and do a quick introduction of everybody, and then we'll start with Ms. Davis, but then when we get to Rob, if you can just give them instructions on how to make public comments.
Good morning, Michael Guston, Assistant Treasurer.
Good morning, Jennifer Wagner, Treasurer and Chief Financial Officer.
Kevin Ashley, Director of Financial Reporting and Transparency.
Jim Crossett, board member.
Dr. Moffett, board member.
Brandon Craig, board member.
Emma Mueller, internal audit supervisor.
Good morning, Cody Hutchins, contract analyst.
Hello, I'm Nan Hagan, manager of state and federal programs. Good morning, I'm Michelle Dunn with the Cincinnati Federation of Teachers.
Who needs that microphone?
And then Rob, do you want to give them the instructions?
Rob Wilson, technician. And if you'd like to speak during the speaking of the public session, please click the hand icon. We will ask you your name and school association, and we will invite you to speak at the end of the meeting. Thank you.
All righty. So we have a packed agenda, and as always, my goal is always to beat former Morosky's policy committee meeting timing. So don't want to leave any don't want to get us too far off track. But I want to start by thanking our newest board member, Mr. Crossett, here for joining us today. Again, this is good fun start to being on the board is coming to these meetings. Hello, come on in, grab a seat. The first thing on our agenda today is there we go. Revert. Is to do a just our budget update. We've done it each month until we finally pass our appropriations. So Treasurer Wagner, is there
Sure. Good
any
morning,
updates?
everybody. We are at the very tail end. So we have everything loaded in the budget software. We did all the work to close the gap that was estimated because of the Esther Cliff and all those other changes. And then we loaded everything into the budget software, and we still have a little bit of a difference to balance. And so we've come up with some activities where we're recalculating average salaries now that everybody's rolled over to their new salary step, to see if there's any savings there. Looking at some other contracts like the Wi-Fi for families, reducing cell phone contracts of people who don't use their district cell phones. And we're plugging away. We're hoping by next Monday, we'll be able to come with an appropriations resolution to get this budget put to bed finally.
All righty. I would be excited to make that the case. But it also is why we, as you see on our agenda, are starting early with FY 26's budget to be kind of beginning the discussion of getting us prepared to do so and get it passed on time. So
So I'm going to, I say this all the time, I'm going to repeat it. When you said Wi-Fi for families, that made me cringe. So I'm going to invite our team, admin and treasurer, please look at grants for Wi-Fi. Please look at partnerships. I did have an opportunity to speak to the CEO, Alter Fiber. He's super excited for us to contact him, and I believe Interim Superintendent Murphy is going to do so around Wi-Fi for our families and any partnerships that potentially lie there. So if we could just exhaust every option twice, that would make me feel better. I know you all are, this is not a dig on the team. This is not a dig on the team. This is just, please go around it multiple times when we talk about Wi-Fi. That's it.
Thank you.
and as always, this is why these budget decisions are difficult, right? It's because there's no good, easy decision anymore. And I think this is why we also want to start early for next year, because the board needs to give good direction as to what we think are our priorities in order for us to be able to then kind of build a platform of information to decide what are those hard choices we'll have to make. So, all right, we'll go right into new business. And Actually, before I start with new business, I just want to make one clarity point here is that, and it's my fault because of the way I wrote up the agenda. But I always like to put on things that we put on the end of the agenda, things that we'll cover in future board meetings. And so we made some slight adjustments to make corrections to reflect that there are additional topics at the end of the agenda that are really just to bring them to people's attention. Not something we're actually going to discuss today, but just want to highlight those things that are going to be coming up in the future. But with that being said, I'm going to turn it back over to Treasurer Wagner and her team of great people to go through our monthly financials.
Right, and so we usually kick it off with Kevin Ashley. Right? Okay.
So we're gonna go over the July. Since we didn't have the meeting in July, we'll be providing the report for June. So this slide is the summary slide. Again, we like to put that in there for someone that pulls the information that does its presentation. So it just gets a little bit of that. Go on to the next. So cash investments. This one shows our general ledger, all funds, cash investment balance. Bringing total $330 million. Part of the in July.
Michael.
Sorry about that. So again, 330 million at the end of July. You can see 88.7 million is in operating cash, 125 million, 0.5 million in Star Ohio. Our long-term investments about 77 million. And then debt related, the sinking funds that will pay those is 38.7. Next slide. This is just the US Bank general operating account, and we've been doing some tweaking as far as what that balance holds, and anything that we can invest in Star Ohio, we're doing that. So you'll see the balance is a lot lower in July, and that's partly because we have 125 million in Star Ohio. So, but just to give you some perspective of how we're seeing, trying to maintain that account. And I did footnote that there because otherwise it's like, where did that go? But that's exactly where that went. Next slide is cash balance by fund. Again, general fund 180 million, debt service 87 million, and you can see the others there. One of the reasons the grants is positive here is because we have not processed the return of advances, but those were approved at the last board meeting. So once we do that, those will probably be negative again. Next slide is going to focus on just general fund. This is the cash balance. The 180 is the current cash balance after everything was rolled over and then what was received in July. And encumbrances were at 72 million. Next slide. This shows the general fund cash balance. And you can see for the new year, it's at 180. Last year it was down in the 130 range at this time. So that's good news. That's on track. Next slide is revenue by source. And then it also shows the total at the top of each column. But for July of this fiscal year, 153 million is the total revenue. And what I put in there is what was on the forecast as far as budget, 623.7. So that's our preliminary for this year. The next slide is expenditures by type. Again, total expenditures were up a little bit during the year. And I do have, that's actually where I had some notes on that. Salaries and benefits were up, purchase services, some things related to ITM and transportation. Also, looking back to last year, could have been things that were shifted to ESSER that may have come back this year. So all of those things factor into that increase. Next slide is one that Mike puts together. It's just a statement of cash flow for the general fund. It gives a little more detail. I actually like this, this. Like to add anything?
No, this is good. This is a positive cash flow now, which is always nice to see. Obviously, we noticed that was property tax abatements. We did get some significant rebate.
So before we move on, just want to make sure if there are any questions on, because I think the next thing goes into preschool. So any questions about revenue or expenditures? And I also want to welcome in a couple more people who have joined us in here today. So just quickly, if folks want to introduce themselves if they haven't already.
Hi, I'm Ben. I apologize.
Yeah, that's fine.
Hi, I'm Sally Grimes with Activities Beyond the Classroom.
And we have one other.
House Director of Positive School Culture.
We want to make sure everybody knows who's here. So
I just wanted to make a comment about the finances. So if you'll recall on the cash balance slide, bar slide, where you're comparing the 3 years, just want to keep noting that our cash reserves are declining as we move on. So we need to hold the line on not overspending our revenues. You're gonna hear me say that every month.
We're gonna record it and just.
long after Jen is gone, we'll still keep this recording going. Continue on, Kip.
Then there's two slides related to preschool. Obviously in July, there were no preschool students, so we don't have calculations for tuition assistance. We haven't made United Way payments in July, so, but just to give you, that is the actual activity for July in that middle column compared to where it was last year. Next slide, again, there's no change in this slide. It's the same that we saw back in the end of May.
I think it's worth pointing out on this slide, though, you know, again, this is why we're going to have a conversation about what we do with the operating levy that contains the preschool dollars, is because we're, you know, we haven't seen a decrease. In fact, we've seen nearly nearly a 75% increase where they were in 2020, 2021 to where we are now, right? So we're looking at 400 more students receiving tuition assistance, and that's not something that's going to go down. So
Right. But yeah, so don't make the mistake of saying that our enrollment went up. Our enrollment went up a lot, but this does not equate to enrollment. It's just students receiving financial assistance.
no, and I think that's the key part to it, is that is what in part we are having to help pay for. And I think that's where we have to make sure, as we think about that operating levy, that we really be thinking about whether or not the amount that we plan for still meets the needs and the resources that we're providing. Yeah.
So if you put the slide 15, Rob, around the expansion, we did kind of skirt through this, and I do want to bring up to the forefront a couple of things and ask some questions around the special education support line. And we're talking July to July. So that seems relatively consistent. The administrative support, can you explain the increase there for July? And then professional services and supplies and materials. I think I know the answer, but I want to make sure that it's publicly stated, in addition to the buildings equipment capital outlay going from 0 last year to an increase of 150,000. So you could explain those increases from last year to this year.
So I believe that line for building equipment, it was equipment and capital type items that were purchased. It wasn't building. It might have been improvements when I looked at that. The special education and administrative support are simply salaries and benefits. And so I did notice in the administrative support, I think there are more like itinerant specialists. There might be some additional things that were added there. I have the detail of what that involves that were allocated to that. So, but we could bring that back next month. I could give you some more detail on that
You
next.
can just follow up with you.
Yeah, I'm wondering, because I want to differentiate that we are not talking about St. Peter's Promise, these are our students, correct? And so I'm wondering, what did we do in July to have an increase for our preschool students where we had no students in July? So or could those have possibly been the Ramble building improvements? I'm wondering what those are, but there's no explanation, so I would like to see that it's not a relatively consistent increase like the special education support where I would expect it to go up by a certain percentage. That is a significant increase. So if you could follow up, then why? Thank you.
Certainly.
Keep it going.
So that's all I have. I think the next section is probably grants.
So, I'm gonna turn it over actually to mandate. There's a problem. Are you hearing me talk about grants? But managers are managers taking federal grants. Then you know about a year now, I think. So I'll let her go through the grants.
All right, next slide, please. All right, so we're really in the home stretch of fiscal year 24 state and federal grants. Our final expenditure reports are due September 30th. So really this last 2 months, we're just trying to get our encumbrances chased down, get everything billed, make sure everything's been paid out that's going to hit. We've done a really great job, I think, of spending this year's allocations. As far as this year's initial allocations, we're 100% spent. And then we've put a pretty good dent in carryover. So we made a lot of efforts along those lines this year. You can see we're quite a bit, next slide. We're quite a bit, ahead. We've really been trying really hard this year to get the money spent, to make contact with principals, to reach out and really proactively, identify ways to get this money to the kids. So we're quite a bit ahead of the last 2 years and on target with our spending at this time. The next slide. So these are all of our consolidated grants, really the main funds that are flexible to reach out to the kids and have an impact. And again, you can see that we've pretty much fully spent the current year, fiscal year 24 allocation across these grants. And we are trying to as well spend the significant carryover that we've seen in the last few years. And we are having a big impact on that. And our primary goal there is just, of course, to never give money back to the state or the feds, but to make sure it gets to our kids where it belongs. And so we should see seeing some increase as we see these encumbrances of $2 million. That's our goal right now, is to reach out to everybody, get invoices in, get things paid, make sure everybody's time has been paid and that we have an impact. Next slide. As far as ESSER, it's also the end of the life cycle of ESSER. So we're also on the home stretch there of trying to get that last amount of money spent out and make sure we don't give any of those funds back. You can see the gap is narrowing greatly. Next slide, I have the numbers. And so again, we're down to a very small amount out of the original 300 million. We've got 7 million that is not yet obligated, but those are planned for and will be spent. The same issue here, we're just chasing down contracts and POs and trying to make sure that everything comes in on time so that we're able to get reimbursement. And then the last slide. I don't have a lot of information on this year because we're really just jumping into the spending. Principals are just back, managers are getting settled. But for the most part, our initial allocations for consolidated apps this year were right on target with last year. There's only about a $500,000 difference between what we received last year to this year. And that's solely due to the non-competitive supplemental school improvement. So, there were no surprises there of increases or decreases. As you can see, 87% of that goes to the public schools and the rest is shared equitably with the non-public. And so we are just working on getting budgets finalized, getting plans in place, and hitting the ground running.
Awesome. Any questions around state and federal grants? Hearing none. Again, always good to see us getting ahead of the game with regard to spending out our resources that we have. I know this has been something for at least the last 3 years. It's been a constant conversation point of how do we make sure we're getting things allocated? How do we make sure you guys are getting the POs? How do we make sure that we're actually spending the money that we have been granted to make sure that we're actually providing all the services that we can to our students?
So I'll be brief because I typically have been really on you guys about the grants. I know you guys are smiling like, oh my God, what is she about to say? So I want to say thank you because this has been a constant thing for me that we get the title money to the schools and the schools are able to spend it to the students. And you all have demonstrated significant improvement in representing that. So I want to make sure that while I always trust in you, I want to make sure that I am equal about grades too. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for helping the schools be more efficient. Thank you.
Excuse me, Nan's done a great job in creating the culture of the grants team to be more of a side partner with our schools. Principal Solomon Gray yesterday used the term, or the other day, a shoulder to shoulder partner, which I really like that term. So it's become less about, no, you can't do anything, let me slap your hand on compliance. And it is about, let's get help you get a plan that's collaborative and in compliance, and then so you can spend faster. So great job, Nan.
And again, it's a collaborative part to it, right? Like we had to kind of give some guidance on what you can and cannot spend money on to make sure everybody knew, and then we had to give guidance and direction to help people then spend it. And so it's always good to see. We also want to welcome in our superintendent, Ms. Murphy. Thank you for coming in. Although you don't want us to refer to you as Ms. Murphy. Say Superintendent Shauna. Let's continue on.
All right, so, yes, the next one is to talk about state restricted aid. So when we get our money from the state, there's two buckets, kind of unrestricted aid and restricted aid. The restricted part is used for different student populations. Part of our state foundation formula that gets funded every month. And so I think what we want to do, and this slide's a really good estimate, is to look at this year 25, how much money we believe we're going to get. We've got a couple supplement needs, so tracking there. How much money we budgeted to spend, and then the really interesting thing is the difference. So, right, so like for example, the big one is like English language. State's going to give us about $1.8 million of targeted aid for them, and we're planning on spending about 12.8. Right, so we're spending $11 million on top of state restricted aid for that population. This is all FY25 budgets. So we also took a look at the FY24. So we did analysis on that to basically go through and make sure we spent what we need to spend. The numbers are very similar, so I'm not going to kill you guys with slides and double up the slides, but
it's appreciated.
So yeah, so the next slide, Rob, and we can go through these pretty quick, but just give you an idea of how they work. Like this is career tech. We're getting, we're spending it over an additional $500,000 in general fund on top of the state restricted share for that. The notes at the bottom are kind of show where the money goes. So for each of those, we pull out X number of expenses every time. We say this is what we're using basically for that restricted. We have really nice tracking of both sides. Here's what we got. Here's how it's. And so you can go through the other slides. They're all going to be the same. The next one's disadvantaged people impact aid, EPIA, for economically disadvantaged students.
For just a second, the reason we're going into this, and it's so important to get it out there, is the state is going to start auditing our compliance on these lines instead of just the state funding formula itself. So they're going to go look to make sure that they funded X amount of dollars on ELL kids. Did we really spend that money on those English language learners, or do we repurpose it for something else in the general fund? And so we're being very meticulous about making sure that our budgets are in alignment so that when we do spend it, that we are easily in compliance.
Are all of these overages that we're adding to coming through general fund or title fund?
This is just general fund and it's the overages come from the unrestricted side of the formula. Those are choices that we make to spend more money on than the state's willing to fund.
So, which leads me to my next question. So for instance, there is a title line for English language learners. So we're compensating $11 million. And we could additionally be spending more money with grants.
The grants are supposed to be supplemental to what we're doing. So whatever's defined by one of our formulas or required by the state or by collective bargaining agreement. So we have all our staffing formulas. Those have to be funded by the general fund because they're required and they're required for all across the district. State and federal grants are supposed to be supplemental on top of that to give them more supplemental services to help them because of their condition as either students with disabilities or English language learners.
So when you say that the state is auditing us or potentially will audit us, is there representation on, hey, this is what the state is funding, this is what general fund is funding, this is what title is funding? Like, can we represent that this is the total amount that we are spending for this particular category?
Yeah, so they will audit the general fund, and then if they pick one of those, like the Title III grant as another grant, they will do that. But yes, that's what these reports are doing for us, is to make sure that in the general fund that we are clearly in compliance with the way the formula is allocated.
Well, I think let me ask my question. So if I were to look and say, I were a funder and I've got $1 million and I say, hey, how much do you spend on disadvantaged students? Can I look to see that there's this much with your general fund, this much with your state, this much with title? Can I look to see that? We're just only seeing a snapshot.
Right.
Today's snapshot is pure general.
And
The title reason order is $700,000.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
And I think, Mike, you said it early on with this, the purpose of this is also to show the specific types of use of those funds, which is also how you designate which funds you're using for what. Because again, I think to the treasurer's point, some things we're never gonna be able to do out of any other title funds because those are things that we have as a regular process that we have to fund. There are things that we do that are supplements
Right.
that we can use title funds for or general
Right.
fund.
So to Dr. Buffett's point, so when we talk about career tech expansion, when we schedule that conversation, we'll come with, these are all our funding sources, this is how we're spending it collectively. Because, you know, it's great, it's a great strategy to expand, but we need to make sure that we have the funds to fund it.
That's what I was.
Right.
One thing, couldn't see all of the revenue, all of the expenditures with that.
Be right.
Well, next couple slides. English language learners. That's probably our biggest gap. Between restricted and actual spend. Gifted is also a pretty big gap. We do a lot for different students. And then the final one on here is student wellness, which has a long history. I think we discussed in this meeting before about being becoming separate grants and then getting pushed into the state funding formula, which cut dramatically down the money we get from. If you remember, I think last year it wasn't separate, it was about $11-12 million. Now it's like going forward. So
Can you go back to the ELL slide for just a second? I just want to make a point.
Sure.
So the state gives us $1 million and whatever that number is, I can't see that far without my glasses. Thank you. And then Title III is only another $1 million. We're spending 12. Okay, so that's the story, is that we are spending, the state and federal government aren't giving us money to support our ELL kids. That's the point I'm trying to make.
yeah, so student wellness, so that's the one that's changed over time. We spend plenty of money there on all our things. So I think that's kind of the end of that section. If you guys have any other questions about those.
Any questions from? I think
We'll probably only do this once or twice a year, not every month.
No, I think this is an awesome thing to always bring to the attention. I think one of the things that for me is it's an interesting point. Sometimes we have the conversation about what do we provide for our students because we have such diverging needs in our students, right? So we have a growing population of ELL and multilingual learners, and we have a growing group of students who are younger in some ways, who need some of the supportive services that are around student wellness. And it's important for us to recognize and appreciate that we are spending far beyond what the state gives us for it, but also what other grants and stuff. So we're having to take money out of what would otherwise be the open pot of general fund resources to dedicate to these things. And it's to your point, Mike, that we used to get a lot more from the state when they separated it out to then put it as part of the formula where we get a percentage of what each student.
It was $12 million when it was in a separate grant. Now it's 4.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're talking about $8 million that we now have to make up somewhere. And I think the state always says we can make it up with our voters. It's a lovely thought. It's not true, but I think it is something for us to constantly be keeping in our mind as we think about budget priorities going forward, is that these are things that we should do, that we need to do, but they're not something that the state is giving us money for or that we get a bunch of grants to do. So do appreciate bringing that to our attention. I think we now are on to return on investments.
Yes, thank you. So Cody Hutchins here again, and we're going to talk about return on investment. And next slide, Rob, will be specifically on school social workers of attendance. So I just want to pause for a second and say thank you to Ms. House for coming in today and collaborating with her team yesterday. They made me feel comfortable with this data and gave me some pointers and some clarification on data. So just want to say thank you for that. So first slide here, what we're going to be looking at is average attendance hourly percentages cumulative across the year, the data I got from ITM. This first graph really just shows the comparison of the attendance rates at the schools that currently have a school social worker of attendance from FY23 to FY24. I do want to note that we just started doing the school social workers of attendance last year. So there's not a lot of historical data on this yet, but just to kind of show where things are trending. Couple notes just to make here. Just an outlier there would be Western Hills, and I want to point some information that Ms. House and her team gave me out on that. So West High, when their school social worker attendance originally got there, they realized that the attendance tracking was kind of all over the place and severely inaccurate. So once that school social worker of attendance started to get those reports more accurate, it actually resulted in more missed attendance, actually. So some of the kids were actually counted as present when they were never there. So that was just one thing they wanted to note. And then also per ODEW guidelines, students that were withdrawn for being a no-show for multiple school years. So that reduced that rate as well. So that's how you can see that their attendance rate actually declined. So we're also getting better at our processes. We're now getting more accurate, and this data will continue to reflect that way. All right, next slide, please. So this right here, this graph is just a continuance of the FY23 to FY24 comparison. But what I did here was also include the other high schools that do not have a school social worker of attendance, which will prompt my point here. The school social workers of attendance are in the Title I high schools. And so that's why I wanted to show this comparison, just to show the schools that do not have one, the ones that do, just to kind of see where things are going. I do want to point out some outliers here as well, non-traditional schools. They're on this list, but I didn't do a cumulative average of all the different schools because it would kind of skew the data. So I wanted to represent them separately, but Lighthouse and Virtual, with their lower population of students and the demographic that they have, it kind of, those are little outliers on there. I just wanted to point out. Let's see here. So just a few things to note here as well from the data. So the data we're looking at represents attendance. If you'll recall, back in FY23, we shifted our focus from focusing on attendance to chronic absenteeism, or at any point in time that you're missing 10% of the school. So back in October of 2023, our Positive Schools Culture team teamed up with Cincinnati Children's Hospital to start tracking chronic absenteeism. And according to their data, I don't have it represented here yet, but I think it'll be a great segue to open this back up in the future to do a deeper dive. And I'll explain why here in a second. But I do want to note that they had a decrease in chronic absenteeism at 8 of the Title I schools. So positive work there. I love to show that data, but like I said, I didn't have that ready in time. So I want to come back and I apologize for that. That is awesome data. And also they wanted to note that overall home visits increased for the district, with the school social workers of attendance completing over 37% of their home visits by April of last year. So making some good positive strides in that work. And then I'll pause right there and before we go on to the next section, if anybody has any questions, or if Ms. House wants to add anything that I missed.
Yeah.
Thanks, Greg. Can you just say the headline one more time? It's like the thing we should take away from this graph is that this was a good investment, this was a lousy investment, this was a we're not sure investment.
For me, what I would say is we're not sure at the moment because there's not enough long-term data to track. And I would like to look at the chronic absenteeism because based on chronic absenteeism data that they have that shows it's doing well. I mean, we've had it decrease in 8 schools. So that's a good thing, obviously. From the data that I had based on absenteeism or attendance, I apologize, shows that it really just kept it from getting worse. There are some schools that their attendance rates went up. There are some that went down. We talked about a couple of those outliers. So what I would say is right now, unsure based on, but I do think it's trending in a positive direction based on that chronic absenteeism data that I would like to dig into.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Piggyback on the comment that he just recently made regarding the. What's that? Okay. Regarding having the social workers working with the school on attendance, we are noticing that the data is more accurate. So when the data is more accurate, we might see an increase of absences or even chronic absenteeism because we're more accurate in our data. But I think overall, holistically, when we see a decrease in chronic absenteeism, that's really great work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. House. All right, next slide, Mr. Rob.
Well, so just before we go forward, do you have anything?
Well, I was going to ask about the trend, but I can wait because I do think what you said is what resonated with me to my colleagues' point. The accuracy of the data is important. Being consistent is what we need. If that consistency comes over time. So I was going to ask about historically, what has been the trend for our Title I schools, but could have, you know, or it's not accurate.
I can bring that back to you
Okay.
on the data that we have and then see where that's at, accurate or not, or at least give us something to look at. I like that idea, so I can.
You said that you have not prepared it for today, but what were you going to bring back?
Miss Madaris, is that how you spell her last name? Medeiros. Miss Naomi Medeiros provided me a document that they have with Cincinnati Children's that shows the chronic absenteeism rates from 23 to 24. I did not have that ready because I proactively, I did not meet with them early enough. I will take blame for that. So going forward, what I would like to do is revisit that and get that data so that way we can accurately present where that product is.
Into Ms. House, are we in line just with this data? I know it's tough, it's not a historical trend, but are we in line to what other large urbans are seeing around at attendance and absenteeism? Are we pretty close on our numbers, you know?
So it's hard to say, but I can come back with that just to kind of let you know in the comparison of what we see versus the other urbans.
I know it's a state issue. I know the governor talked about it. And so it's not a trick question. I'm just wondering, since it has made it to the governor's office, is it an issue that other urbans are tracking this way? And are they seeing data that we're seeing? Or are we being our innovative self and being creative? So that's what I'm wondering.
I think that it is an issue that is noticeable across the state. We are blessed to partner with Children's, who's very invested not only in other topics, but specifically this topic. So just working with us on our strategies. I think that there are things that Cody might mention in the presentation as far as kind of our database that we have collectively put together on strategies as a team to be able to help support and reduce chronic absenteeism.
Okay. And does that include maybe some reasons why? I know we have a large transient population across the state. Are we looking at some of the causal effects of that affect the absenteeism? Are we taking it off the paper that way? I know I'm not trying to trick you. I'm just wondering, like, can we get in front of some of this data?
Yes, I think that some of these, one of the strategies that we create based on the data and demographics and what we know about families and some historical trends, we create kind of what's called like a hot list where we really try to target in specific areas or with families and figure out what supports are needed. And then the social workers increasing their home visits has really helped in building that relationship and communication and aligning resources. We're just constantly coming up with different ways. I think when I spoke to some of our staff that kind of deal more on the court side, when we actually have to refer to court, they were really discussing that some of the situations are unfortunate. And one of the gaps that we do see is how to continue to provide supports for families that need it, that kind of prevent them from sending their students to school.
Dr. Moffitt, if I might share, I wanted to just make sure you were aware that in the Urban 8 Principals Group, attendance is one of the top areas they want to have conversation about and share strategies about. So that's one. So yes, large urbans are seeing this as a critical issue. The second thing, speaking of children, I think that our school social workers and attendance clerks are doing an amazing job. That commitment to school social work is very different than it was 10 years ago, because I can remember as a high school principal having a school social worker one day out of the week. Not very effective at all. I don't know a principal who says they don't appreciate having a person the full complement of the week. We are in conversation. This is new with Children's Hospital, who have, yes, been an amazing partner, to talk about that whole child piece. I think the next step that's missing for us is what happens in school, home, and the community. And what I mean by that is we may have a child who is in the emergency room Wednesday night and in some type of crisis. And maybe they come to school the next morning after having 2 hours sleep. And you can imagine what their school day might be like, but we don't have that connector. And so we're trying to talk about how we can change that narrative. Or let's say they don't come to school and we just are marking them absent without knowing there are some resources that family needs for the kid to be successful. So look forward to sharing more about that.
And we know holistically the conversation around attendance and absenteeism are actually two different conversations, though, because you can attend at the beginning of the day, leave midday, and you go up in your chronic absenteeism numbers because it's the hours that you're missing of school, versus the idea of, do we get the students to the building and in the door? And so I think that may be also part of the conversation as we think about the long-term, how we measure these things, success. Because working in Clifton, I know that a lovely amount of students sometimes want to venture around in the middle of the day. And we want to make sure they're staying in the school and getting the resources they need when they're there. So I think it's great for us to be keeping that on the
And I know too,
forefront.
Board Member Craig, everybody's really passionate about what's happening with our students experiencing homelessness.
Yeah.
So sleeping in a car under a bridge or in substandard housing the night before is
Absolutely.
a barrier to getting to school and getting to school prepared. So we continue to work with that.
Absolutely. Keep us going, Coach.
Thank you all for all the comments and insight. Next slide, Rob. So we're going to shift a little bit, still talking about the attendance rates here, but how they compare and what they look like in looking at the data from an economic disadvantage standpoint. So as I mentioned, the school social workers of attendance are in the Title I high schools. Typically Title I, you could think of as economically disadvantaged. And one of the ways we identify your Title I eligibility is looking at something called an ISP, or Identified Student Percentage. It's the percentage of the students within that school that identify for free and reduced lunch rates. So our CEP data and the data that we use to determine our Title I eligibility. As you can see here, what I did, you can see the title says prior to multiplier. So just some insight. What the ODE does, or what the state does, is it allows us a 1.6 multiplier that we can multiply our ISP rate by at a school to account for students or families that did not turn in that free and reduced lunch rate form. So we'll have two graphs here that kind of show the similar data, but one is prior to the multiplier. So that's on the screen now. So as you can see, the schools that identify with a student, school social worker of attendance have about a 15% higher on average rate of identified students who identify for free and reduced lunch. And this data is as of April of 2024. And I just want to say thanks to Student Dining Services for helping me out with this data. Next slide, Rob. Same data here, except for I just did it after the multiplier just to show how much higher things get once you throw in that multiplier. So why a lot of our kids and a lot of our students in our schools get free and reduced lunch rates. You can see that the rates change here a little bit, but you'll still see about 26% of the schools with the school social worker of attendance higher than the schools without on that ISP percentage. So any questions on those two? Yes, sir.
Yes, Craig, just make sure I'm understanding.
Yes, sir.
This is saying that in the schools where there's a social worker,
Mhm.
you have a higher share of kids.
That is what the next graph, that was gonna be the question. So when I did this data, I asked myself that same exact question and working with Jen, she asked that question. So we wanted to show a representation of how that works. So if you go to the next slide, Rob. So that's the thought. So the in light red is the schools that have the school social worker of attendance. The thought would be that the higher that line, the ISP, the higher that percentage, the lower the bar would be on your attendance. So asking the question, is it related if a school has more of an economically disadvantaged population, are their attendance rates lower? Just kind of one of those facets we wanted to look at. Tackling that whole child idea, just the first piece to look at. The reverse you can see is very evident. It's like a Walnut or a Clark, that line is very low, but their bar is very high. So their attendance is very high, but they have a low population of economically disadvantaged. Whereas like a Lighthouse, I know I said earlier that they were kind of a non-traditional, but that would kind of show what that data looks like. Taft is another good example. Their line goes above their bar. So that's kind of how, does that help answer that question, sir?
Keep going and I will let you know.
Okay.
I will, I'm trying to piece it together.
Yes, sir. Actually, that was it I had on this slide. So the next one would be PPA. So
Just before we go up, I think one of the things you can see on there though is that there may be a correlation, but not specifically a causation. So, the schools that necessarily have the highest number of economically disadvantaged are not necessarily going to also inversely have the most attendance issues, but they're more likely to fall in line with each other for obvious reasons. I think Superintendent made that point as well, where you have a family who's more economically disadvantaged, they're more likely to have housing instability, they're more likely to have health concerns and other issues that might prevent their attendance. I think one thing that might be, at least for helpful for an understanding kind of going forward and how we invest in that, is to look at what maybe are those factors that are connected to the economically disadvantaged concerns, and what are factors that are like, geographic location. If you're in a place where your bus route is harder to get to, or these type of things that might not necessarily always tie along with being economically disadvantaged, is that a deterrent for getting to school, or are there other factors that might be connected in? Because I can imagine, again, thinking about Taft, where the population of students is one thing versus, if we look at Withrow's numbers, up, but there's a culture and history in some places also of how those social workers interact with parents. And so, that would be a good conversation point for us to be thinking about in the narrative side of it as with the data.
So this is to my colleague's point, Mr. Lindy, this is a lot of information in this slide, and it's not fair. It doesn't really represent everything there. So to the point of not having enough data, I think that's accurate, particularly in this slide. But then this data, it doesn't represent everything I'm having a hard time seeing, like, okay, they have a school social worker. It should be down but it's not representative of that. So for me, I need to see it, maybe the same graph, but with differentiation of the data points, so that I can see the number. If they have a social worker, maybe they're a different color. What the attendance, I just need to see it a little differently off the paper. And I think that even if you were to, like, to me, the blue represents attendance percentage, but there's so much to that it seems unfair to put just that number, because it doesn't represent everything. So I think you are on the right track. I think we are mano a mano, but I just, for me, need to see it a little differently because I think I need to see more of it. So maybe even, disaggregating it month to month or quarter to quarter is a little bit better because it would help me see a little bit more of trend data since we don't have a lot of it, but it would see it in a smaller window. If I looked at the schools, and I know you were trying to put all the schools on one, but if we looked at like Aiken Q1, CDA Q1, like it may have a little bit better representation of data for me.
Absolutely.
Because we don't have a lot of it. So this is awesome. I don't think it has enough to show us that there's justification to
Yes.
have a social worker in every building at this point. I think that we should. Kudos to our social worker. But I also think that there are so many other factors I would love to see partnerships with that building. We talk about cost per student, but what is that building? What resources are going into that building that make their number this versus another building where their number is maybe better? What are some similarities that we could put there, or what are some differences? Is it location? I know each building has a culture, but I think that because we don't have enough longevity with data, we need to look at the things that we do have and see if there are some inferences that we can make with that data. Because to me, the attendance and absenteeism is super significant that we're being judged on a report card and the governor is taking up time for it. So we need to look at what is going into this so that we can accurately represent our students, get the city involved with regard to the community piece. Are they transient? Is that why the numbers in one particular school are lower or higher because that school has a less transient vote? There are just so many things that go into that number just doesn't represent. So to board member Lindy's point, it doesn't represent everything. It's still a little confusing, but I think it's on the right track. And I just think it's just too much on this one slide, but you're on it. I mean, and kudos to our social. There's a lot of skills.
I think my brain is several blocks behind everything else. Catch up. I think what I want to share gratitude for is the efforts to look at return on investment. Things fabulous. Like I think if you go back, you tell me if I'm wrong about this, Treasurer Wagner, but I think this is a whole lot more than we used to do 5 years ago.
Oh, we didn't do anything 5 years ago. So yes.
Look, progress over perfection, so we're spending, $600 million in public money. We're actually trying to figure out what's working and what isn't working. I think that's great.
Yes, sir.
When did, is this on board docs?
Yes.
Which one is it?
It's in the
Should
monthly.
be the monthly financials.
It's in the monthly.
Yeah, it's kind of all sandwiched together.
We put everything in one PowerPoint, so it makes it easier for Rob to manage instead of going to 12 different files.
Rob created. Sorry, which one? On the monthly I pulled up. There.
So I think this, one thing, what occurred to me on this particular slide is if we had done two slides side by side or two graphs side by side, the title ones on one side, the non-titles on the other, I think the lines and the bars would make more of an impact. So, yeah, so we're still trying to figure out like, what does really return on investment mean in academics? Because, and the reason it's so hard then in corporate is we're not measuring profit, right? We're measuring, and there's so many human factors that impact a measure. So, but something you said earlier, every school is a social worker. These are second social workers in the classroom that are in the schools that are focusing just on attendance. And so because it was a new initiative, we wanted to start tracking it. I suspected the data would go down because I suspected that once we started paying more attention to the tracking, it would be more accurate and be lower. And so it is too soon to tell whether it's a good investment or not. But we'll continue to monitor it as we go forward.
Mr. Lindy?
First, just quick, I'm trying to figure out how I can be more helpful for you all in future meetings. So thank you for showing me what else on board docs. I got it. When did that post?
Probably yesterday, last night, maybe. Today's Friday.
In the future, what I'd like to make sure I do is a better job of doing my And so I think I can come with better questions about what I understand and understand if I'm doing less on my feet. So if I wanted to look for these slides before a future finance committee meetings, when should I check board docs?
Our goal is to get them by 1 o'clock on Thursday, the day prior.
So I'll save some time on the Thursday afternoons before a Friday finance committee meetings, and I will come with a better set. I'll try to let you know.
Okay, no, the questions are great. This is great conversation.
I just want to say thank you, and I invite all of it because it's helping me learn as I'm learning something new. I get to team up and partner, and sitting there with Ms. House and her team yesterday, and I'm just blown away by listening to their passion talk about it and the things that they notice, they realize, and what they want to do going forward. So giving me that opportunity and giving the district that opportunity to collaborate across different departments to understand, like, I'm a money guy. I may not understand why people are absent. It's not something I always look at. But being able to do that, now I get to understand from a whole and kind of incorporate, as the super said, whole child.
Yeah.
So Treasurer Wagner, I want to clarify because you said something that I was not aware of. So every title school has a social worker?
Every school in the district has a social worker.
Every school has a social worker. This was an initiative to put an additional type social worker in some of the buildings, correct?
That's
In the
correct.
title building.
In the title buildings, yes.
So can we differentiate which buildings have, I think that's super important to note, because I missed it, that every school has a social worker, but some schools have two. And so for me, when I'm thinking of return on investment and budget, I want to look at the schools that have two, their numbers from a return on investment standpoint. should have
That's what these
gone
numbers
down.
are.
Yeah.
It's these pink ones on here.
Okay.
So if we separate them, I think it'll
make better.
visually, it'll make more sense, I think.
I got you.
Okay. And
I'd
again,
just like to clarify, this initiative was only started with high schools as of this year. They had the larger title funds and had the funds to be able to participate in this initiative. So at this point, they were only placed in high schools
yeah.
that chose to allocate their Title I money.
And this was something the board decided on last budget cycle to add in as an additional person to we had to come up with the right title for it, but the additional person to focus on chronic absenteeism and attendance in the schools. It became the social worker because that was also part of the work that some of the social workers were already doing.
It's kind of twofold. So one was we're trying to use the data to drive the spending, right? And particularly in title, because that title was being underspent. So we're saying this is supposed to be supplemental. And so here is your decision tree on how to spend your money. So if you recall, the decision tree says, if you're a Title I high school, you get a school social worker of attendance. If you had reading scores of X, you got a reading specialist. If you had graduation scores of Y, you had another counselor that was focused on graduation. So we're trying to help the school spend the money wiser and faster using the data to drive that spend. So it's kind of a holistic way of looking at spend.
But all right, keep us going, Cody.
Oh, just one point, small
Of
point of,
course.
Yes.
just additional information, just so that it's understood, the attendant social workers, split caseloads between the high schools, so it's not just one individual. It's on, just not one individual attendant social worker is assigned to just that one high school. They do have a caseload of a couple of high schools that they support. One thing that's not represented in any graph is because of the impact of the attendant social worker, they're able to provide more social emotional learning supports for students, which also impacts attendance. So it's not represented in a graph, but that's another factor because of this additional support that's provided.
Keep us going, Cody.
Absolutely. All right, last slide for this particular topic, and then we'll change gears. Just looking at the per pupil cost. So using enrollment data collected at the end of FY24 and using average budgeted salary for FY24. Dividing those out by the students, you'll see the average PPA across there. I just want to make a note real quick. Riverview and Euler did share a school social worker of attendance. So I just want to make that note there. And then Euler, obviously their population is a lot smaller. So that's why their costs look so much more. I don't want that to go overlooked. But that would be the last slide on school social worker of attendance. Any questions before we shift gears?
I just will note that to the point that you just made, I think one of the difficulties also with looking at per pupil cost is that sometimes it's just one that we add and we can't change the value of the number of students involved. So, again, it's something for us as a board to think about as we are making our budgetary decision making and evaluating some of the data, is that sometimes it's always going to be skewed because of there's a need. There's just not, we're never gonna have a student population to match it to bring the numbers down, such as Euler is a great example. But also I think maybe helpful to for future references with that one to also maybe if it's a percentage of their time is spent, maybe doing that calculation as well connected to the per pupil cost. Because if what it looks like right now is that we have 2 people per pupil cost, and if it's only like 60-40, 60% then divided out by the per pupil would give probably a little bit more accurate number to that.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that suggestion. This is wonderful. I love all these suggestions.
Keep us going.
All right, next section here, contracts by vendor. So what this section does is we just want to pull together 2 charts. They're going to kind of represent the same data. You can go to the next slide. Just for FY24 at the end of the year, top 10 vendors by highest dollar amount. First slide would show the highest dollar amount encumbered. And then the second graph, which we'll switch to here in a second, will show highest dollar amount paid. Kind of the same detail. Just wanted to represent both of those. So you'll see vendor on the left column, number of contracts that we had at the end of last year with them. That is just contracts. That does not incorporate purchase orders or things for like smaller material items, but these are just contracts. And then total amount encumbered, and then you'll see total amount paid. I do want to make a quick note that this was at the end of July, so amount paid could go up as we continue to close out NANSA with grants and stuff like that, close out some invoices. So, and then on that slide there, you'll see a little link to the bottom that shows out of FY24 at the end of July, all of the multi-contracts with our vendors. So any vendor that had multiple contracts with us, it shows a list, how many contracts they have and the dollar amount of those. So
Excuse me for jumping in here, but the reason we started looking at this is because of the conversation we had at the last board meeting about the Hamilton County contracts, how many there were, what were they being used for, and I do have an analysis for that. But we're starting to look at other vendors that have multiple contracts or very high dollar values, so that number one, are we properly RFPing them, and 2, is there an opportunity to consolidate? Because from an auditor's perspective, if you're looking at a bunch of little contracts, it looks like you're trying to avoid procurement policy and state law. And so we need to make sure that we're compliant that way. So I've got Cody tracking this information, and we'll start plugging away at these. And so in just a little bit, we'll walk through the Hamilton County's kind of fascinating data. But you can see there are 75 different contracts. It's insane.
Crazy.
So, yeah, and so I'm waiting, here they come, I think. The file that I sent to the team to print out, they only printed the first page instead of all 6 pages of them. So I think she's bringing them here now. Perfect timing. Cody, did you want to say anything else about these?
Not about these, nope. I am just finished with those. So.
And then
if you want to finish up one more slide, Mr. Rob, I think, yep. Just a quick note, for September, topic would be graduation.
awesome.
So just to, if you don't mind jumping into the Hamilton County, since we're talking about vendor contracts,
Absolutely.
the packet that you're receiving, and then the one page that's really big, which I folded over and I cannot now find. Thank you. So the first thing I wanted to show you, I did fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 25 for all Hamilton County contracts. And so the first chart that you see, so it's probably not online yet, Rob, just hang there. That's the last document we're going to go over. So the first chart you see is this pie chart, fiscal year 24 Hamilton County contracts. It shows you 41% is spent from CPS. 15 is the auxiliary and the non-public schools, that the pass-through funds that we talked about. And then 44% is spent by central office. And then I'm showing you the same data as of fiscal year 25, but because we pulled the data on August 7th, there's not a whole lot, it's not as much traffic yet. Most of the data coach contracts haven't been entered into the system yet. So the pie chart changes significantly. the schools, are the blue chart, they only represent 10%, whereas last year they represented 41%. That makes sense? Okay. So then moving on to the next, chart. It's supposed to show you 2 years. Skip that. Hamilton County contracts by budget site, fiscal year 24 compared to fiscal year 25. So noting on there, that's only the first couple weeks of the year of contracts. But you can see by site, by budget site, by school, and by central office department, how money is spent.
Jen, I think they're actually on the but board docs now.
Oh,
Rob,
are
if you
they?
wanna pull up.
Okay. I wasn't clear about the multiple sheets in the spreadsheet I sent, so I apologize for the confusion. But you can see that, in fiscal year 24 for Cincinnati Public Schools, we actually contracted 6.8 million. And then in 25 so far, we've already contracted 3.8 million, from different sites. And then I'm showing you the difference. The following chart is the green chart, which is the most fascinating. This is by category. So, and I had to use the words in the purchase order to determine, and I came up with categories, and they're not always clean, but from year to year. But you can see where we spent $2.6 million in data coaches in 24. Don't sweat it. And so far we only have 337,000 contracted so far. Are you following me on that? Okay. So we sent out a message to the assistant superintendents to say, help, get the school started to get their contracts going, because the data coaches can't start until the contract goes through and gets approved. So we need to get them going. A lot of money spent on ELL services and DSS managers. There's 4 managers that are funded by Hamilton County. We actually looked at during this budget cycle whether it would be better to bring those in-house as employees rather than contracted employees. But it would actually cost us more, because as an employee, you'd pay a year-round salary, and here we're only paying 9 months of services. So it actually makes more sense to leave them as contracted employees or contracted vendors, sorry. And then the tuition at the very bottom, the $1 million, we're required to put a purchase order out there for $1 million every year to cover court place students, either in foster care or in specialty places. We actually never spent any of this in fiscal year 24 because the facility that they were being placed in shut down. And so I guess the kids just got dispersed in other different places. And so they're investigating how we're going to handle that this year. So it hasn't actually been encumbered yet this year. But you can, since you're just reading it and getting it now, you can ask me questions or ask me later and we can go back over it. The big chart shows you by year how we spend the money by fund. So 1.2 million of that major 6.8 spend on the fully encumbered, where general fund was 1.2 million. And so you can see the majority of funds is spent out of either IDEA B or Title I. And then same data on 25 with a grand total of over $10 million over a 2-year period, but we're not even halfway through the year yet. And then I'm just showing you the graph, the 2 comparative graphs on the same document. I kept creating more charts as I went. And I was like, Jen, stop. But this is the beginning, but this is what the kind of information we want to do for all of our major vendors to see how are we using that money? Are they duplicating services? Can we consolidate and negotiate a better master agreement? And then start figuring out how to track for return on investment.
I think this is one of those conversations we started a couple years ago with regard to both the consolidating of some of our contracts where we had multiple schools doing the same contract with, more time. So also streamlining some of that process as well, so that some of our vendors have 30 people reaching out to them for stuff, that there's a more consolidated process to it. So I think looking at these things is really helpful. Are there questions or thoughts?
And this is no statement or judgment at all. Hamilton County is a great partner. We value them very much. And so I don't want people to get nervous about that stuff.
No.
We're just looking to make sure that we're spending our money as wisely as we can.
Dr. Moffitt?
So I love Hamilton County. Thank you for all that you do. But in the best interest of being consistent and being fiscally responsible, we have to look at this. So I am very interested in, I understand that you said the managers, but the DSS for FTEs, it may cost more to bring them in, over a year, but I would really invite us to look at that particular area to see if maybe we have a contract for, we have a full-time person for 9 months. I don't know what that could look like, but the big bucket areas to me are areas that are worth looking at to be a little bit more streamlined and efficient. I am kind of concerned that some of these areas we've spent almost all of the money and school just started 3 days ago.
It's not
So-
spent. This is just encumbered.
Well, we
Right, so we-
encumbered,
Mhm.
that's concerning to me. It's just me, just looking at it. It's just, I'm a little concerned. But I also have a question around, so when we look at the Hamilton County spend for like ELL, is that also represented on the chart? Does that go under what we talked about for Mike? Does that go represented under what we would spend for our ELL students? Is there connectivity there?
If it was spent, if we paid for it out of the general fund, then yes. If not, if it's a grant, it would be not. It would be under the grant spend.
Okay.
I do have deeper charts that show like by budget unit or by category by fund, but they're humongous charts. So I chose not to share those.
That's probably not everybody's interest, but I'll have to come up there and we could definitely do that. Because I would like to look at that, or at least get just further explanation. I think this is great. I'm concerned about, 75 different contracts. Just looking at that at the last board meeting, and it was like 20 of them, and it just made me cringe, but, can you tell me this fiscal year 24, and then looking at fiscal year 25 seems unfair because it's not equal.
Right,
And
just
so
as
I-
year to date.
It's just, yes. So do we have a number for like where we were comparable to this time last year instead of what we've encumbered for 25? Does that make sense?
I think so. I think we can go back and sort on date issued of the PO. Yeah, we can do that.
So that it's more equal to say, okay, well, this time we spent this
Yeah.
much with Hamilton County versus even if we do it by quarter. This time we spent this much. Last year we spent that much. That would help me because this makes me, this brings up emotion, like what in the world's going on?
Yeah, so what,
Percent of the school.
so what we can do is after the first quarter ends, we'll do a quarterly report and do quarter to quarter and then year to date as well.
Yeah, that would help me.
Cool.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
May I ask, just clarifying, just even from my own vocabulary. So 2 things. One, the encumbered, but I think Jen wants the schools to encumber what they're doing. So it
Yes.
sounded like there was a concern there.
So that we should have the majority of money encumbered
Encumbered,
before the year
yes.
starts, because that would greater than a now, right?
Yes.
Yes.
So, yeah, so you
Eh.
would want to see a bulk of it encumbered early on.
Okay. And then the second piece, again, just vocabulary. Some of the like different contracts with the schools, I believe, is because they have different school improvement grants. And so I think they have to be separate. And so then that makes it look like a larger number in terms of, most of the time, I think they're looking for instructional coaches or data coaches.
I think
So they are going to be separate.
I think this is a point, and I know the treasurer and I talked about this before, but like some things we do that we get stuff for that is for a purpose, and then we go and get a vendor to do those services, right? So we get a grant, says you have to do this. So you have to go get a vendor to do that. And those vendors might be the same vendor that's doing it at another school.
Yes.
And I think this is what would be helpful to also kind of differentiate the work that is because we got a grant to do it. And this may be one way of thinking about the funding source versus work that we've said a school wants to do. So we're going to fund it to be
Yes.
done, or a central office resource wants it to be done. And this happens to be the vendor who will do that particular work, because I think that may also help identifying and understanding. Yeah. So if you see a coach or data coach for this reason, but if it's something we've gotten a grant fund for that's paying for that,
Yes.
that's helpful to also delineate that.
So my original understanding was the data coaches were there to help people learn how to analyze the data used to inform instruction. In my mind, it wasn't going to be an every year thing. It was supposed to be building capacity. I could be completely wrong, But then if it is gonna be an annual thing, do we have the same level of analytics across the district, the same skills? And, so is every school getting the best skilled data analyst coach?
And I mean, I use the data coach for example, but I mean, I think
Mhm.
like some of the ELL stuff, again, some programs, there may be a grant for a particular ELL services that we provide that Hamilton County provides the service for that may get in one pocket of
Mhm.
how we fund it. But if they provided a bunch of other ELL services beyond that, what the grants pay for,
Mhm.
we want to make sure we're delineating those two so that we can think about as a board direction.
Right, and to, Shauna's point, and I always stumble because I want to say it's a superintendent. point.
Okay.
It may not be that we may have to do separate contracts, but we could go to a vendor, and it could be any vendor, not just Hamilton County, to say, I know we have 15 different contracts because of the grants, but we have 15 different contracts with this amount of dollar amount and give us a better price. Is
Sure.
kind of where I'm
Yeah,
thinking, so.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the impetus behind my question.
Yes.
Are we saying that this is,
Yeah.
when we think of return on investment, are we saying that this is the best vendor for this service because we've gotten X from them? Not just, oh, we've had them for 5 years, let's tack this on because you can simply do it. And I do think that that due diligence of going back to what the original intent was,
Right,
some of them are on year 3 of 3. So our needs now, I guarantee you, are different than they were 3 years ago. So is that, do we have that need? The other thing I wanted to ask a question around is tuition for core place students at $1 million. I know, and we have had this conversation around our Lighthouse students and like Best Point and things like that, and you've been able to differentiate. Is this for students that require hospitalization or extra services, or is this for our students who have additional academic needs and they cannot be given to us, but we pay for them to get?
so these are court place students. So
Okay.
the court says this student is gonna go into this foster home or this.
Yeah, so for example, a child goes through the juvenile justice system and the magistrate or the judge says, I'm going to place you in this place in a different county or a different area. You can't return to your Cincinnati public school because you need a different level of services or you're in jail. And so we have to pay for their education because they're our kid. So we have to set aside X number of dollars. And we've got that a couple of different ways. And this one happens to just be one of those.
Do we get the same reciprocity?
And the
from
same
other counties?
reciprocity. So if we are servicing a kid from a different county, yes. Mhm.
Do we demonstrate that anyway? And I know we do because I went to a graduation and they said this young man was here. And
Mhm.
he was from a different county up north and he didn't have anyone here. So I know that happens, but I just didn't think of it from a
We-
financial standpoint.
We haven't reported out on it, but we certainly can. We do. It's all, yeah, it's the same way we do with our catastrophic costs and excess costs in terms of it's all done electronically now. It used to be a kabillion papers that are passed between districts. Now it's all done electronically and they tell us where to post the revenue and where to do the expense. So they do it, but we could certainly do an analysis of the ins and the outs.
Well, I was just wondering when
Mhm.
I saw $1 million and then you said that we didn't have the facility. I was wondering, is that something that we could do in-house to save the money, or is that something that?
It's not our decision to
No.
make,
Oh,
no.
okay.
The courts say,
Yeah.
you're in jail.
This is where you go.
This is where you serve your time and
So
how
it's
you
awarded
serve your
the
time.
court and-
That's correct.
And I know the center itself was shut down for reasons, but
But there are other places.
there are other
kids
places to figure
go.
out. Yeah.
Mhm.
All right. Well, to keep us again moving towards our goal of having a efficiently done meeting, will keep us going. So I think we skipped over the quality improvements. So I don't know if we want to circle back to there.
Yep.
I can jump in there. All right.
Cody's the star of the day.
So I'm just gonna keep talking, making Kevin roll for the day and doing all the talking. All right.
One more agenda item.
Yeah.
I'm not.
All right. Well, so on the topic of quality improvement, so my group and my team, we focused on improving key performance indicators. Shocker, the contract guy picks KPIs to work on. But this is just a quick list of members and what they do for our team. Over the summer's been a little chaotic with meetings and trying to get things running with the principals because I don't want to put too much on them this week. So we'll get our team up and going to switch things up a little bit here, but I'm going to talk about what we're doing, why we're doing our project. So key performance indicators that do not meet the SMART standard. So the SMART standard is kind of what we laid out as high quality or defined as high quality. So if it meets the SMART or SMART-E components, that typically on that average, you can find a good quality KPI. When they don't have these, they lack the ability to have clearly defined objectives, clearly defined and measurable outcomes, or even a specific time frame for that measurable outcome. So without the high quality KPI measure attached, how do we do those things? How do we measure vendor performance? How do we ensure that we're getting the most bang for our buck, like we've been talking about? How do we make sure that, to Dr. Moffitt's point, that yes, we've had a vendor do 5 other things for us. How do we know that they're the best for number 6? So KPIs assist with that. They use that data, and the managers and the budget owners meet with the vendors, develop those, so everybody's on the same playing field. So without that quality KPI measure, and why we're doing this project, things that could potentially happen, impacted services for students or staff. So we're not measuring that performance and we don't know that we're getting the best return on our investment. How do we know that contract's performing? Our inability, which is a big thing here, to be good stewards. So I think it is our responsibility to make sure that we're looking at these services and measuring their performance. We owe it to the taxpayers to do so. And then irresponsible budgeting techniques. So just, this is a quick glance at our first simplified failure mode effect analysis. So basically what this does is it outlines the process that we have, identifies opportunities for improvement or failures, and then what we can do to counteract those failures. And like I said, this was the first one. When we see the KDD here, I'll mention our SMART aim and how we're going to shift that, but we'll be having a new one of these coming up soon. So what I represented here was a Pareto chart, and what a Pareto chart does, for those who may not know, you find your failures and it helps you identify your failures. So it helps you identify the rate of your failures, your 80-20 rule. So 80% of your effort can be, 80% of your effects can be taking place in 20% of your items in this conversation contracts. So I want to note here, and the reason I put this on here, just the first thing you can see how we've improved. Look at the failures that we identified in the first chart on the left. Those failures, if you read them, like contract approved without a measure, low quality measure, they're all kind of the same. The failures are really bland, not clearly defined. Where you can see where we are, we've now better defined our failures. We can now better track those of what doesn't make up a good KPI. And then something I also want to point out here, last year in October, we had 82 total missing KPI measures. This year, and this is just July, we only have 13. But the way that percentage broke down, I think it's crazy where we've come. I forgot to write that data down on here because I don't remember how many we had in October contracts wise, but I know that that improvement is astronomical. So we're at least getting KPIs attached and getting them smart. So, and this is just a basic flow chart. Just want to put this on here just to kind of, the SFMEA I showed earlier, this kind of takes it down a level just to show you where we started with our current process and where the future and where we want to go. The biggest thing I wanted to change there was a lot of times on the front end, KPIs were something that people had to get done, so they just put them in. What we wanted to really ensure was that people were working with the vendors and the vendor was aware of that KPI, because it's not fair if they don't know what they're being measured. So
what we discovered is, the educational community tends to be a little verbose. And so we don't need like a term paper from telling us, we just want the X to the Y,
Right,
the data
yeah.
point. And so Cody's done a lot of training on that.
it's been a good growing point. You get to hear the passion behind people's voices when they talk about why that vendor or why that contract is so good and all the facets. And sometimes it is a growing pain to say, hey, what is the most important and what can we focus on measuring? So, but it, like Jen said, it's been great. Next slide. So our key driver diagram. So using all the tools that we've talked about up to this point to develop our global aim, which is to improve overall vendor performance. We just want to make sure that high quality vendor performance leads to better learning opportunities for our students. And then our SMART aim, increase the percentage of central office vendor contracts with SMART KPI measures from 40 to 80% by the end of this past year. So what that's saying is last year we started with 40% of our total contracts had a SMART KPI. We wanted to get to 80. You'll see in the middle there, those are our key drivers and what we focused on that we believe were driving the decisions to make KPI Smart. And then the different interventions. I forgot to put the key on here. I'm so sorry. The key was supposed to be on here to color code why these things are the color they are. Blue, we've adopted those. So that means that we adopted that intervention. Those are things we're going to be doing regularly. Green means we tried those things. We're testing those things. We're trying to make those things adoptions. And then white is for future, or we have not got there yet. So something I want to point out there, if you see read the one in white, it says a hard stopping workflow for missing KPI. So I just want to know, we only have 13 missing KPIs this year, and there wasn't a hard stop. So people were just putting them in voluntarily. Contracts weren't getting rejected without them. We didn't want to hold up services start of the year. So it just shows good data that once we get this intervention, I believe we will be at 100% KPI.
Cool.
Yes, sir, Mr. Lindy.
Lindy.
This is great, very, 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 very cool. If it's easy to do, could you share a couple of examples of KPIs? Contracts?
Yes, I don't have them off the top of my head, but I can get my computer out. And get a
You
couple.
can do it next.
Yes, sir.
I think there's the first thought is a KPI that is smart.
Mhm.
It's better.
Correct.
Next paragraph, I can imagine a huge revenue quality of like what those
Yep.
KPIs actually are. So
Absolutely.
this is the progress and perfection.
Yes, sir.
Getting this. Also. What's it?
Yes. Absolutely. Yes, sir. Yep, I could definitely have those ready. I actually have a few examples that I do on the KPI training that show to those who show up. So I definitely feel those ready available. Nope. All right, the next slide is the important one. So I mentioned we started at 40%. Now you can see as of the last completed board date of 8/5. So that dot is open because this data was as of July, because we do month end of July. Open means that that data point is not complete, but there were contracts in the system that were going to go through board on 8/5. I know that's a lot of verbs, a lot of words, so apologize, but I just want to note we're up from 40% to almost 90 in smart KPI percentage for contracts. So I think we're doing great work. I do want to point out the title says central office. Last year, at the beginning of the year, it was like 80% of contracts were at central office. So that's why we focused it on that. And what I talked about earlier, we're going to be looking to shift our smart aim this year and start taking this work out into the schools, working with the principals, seeing what, because we know the supports they need for this kind of stuff are different than maybe central office may need. So we just want to make sure that they're comfortable, they have what they need. They may not have as many contracts, but it is just as important that they're getting the same attention. So. And then to wrap things up in the next two slides. So our key learnings. So one thing that being a numbers person and somebody that works with systems all the time, something that's very important for me to learn and realize when something's not working, more often than not, it's probably the system, not the person. Many times I've been a part of a system that I followed and it wasn't working. You look at it, you take it, and this whole quality improvement thing is, why is that system not working for the people you're trying to ask to use it? So just really being able to make a human effect out of processes and understand some people may not understand it the way you do. So yeah,
You
making
just
sure that the
quoted
system-
Dr. Deming.
Yeah, that's Brian too. And then another one, this was big in my Impact U class. Qualitative data is just as important, or if not more important than quantitative data. Yes, we may have 10 people that say they're using a system. 10 out of 10 people are using a system. Great. That's awesome. It looks good. It's quantitative, right? Well, 5 out of those 10 hate the system. So the work that they're doing may not be reflective as the other 5 that like the system. So understanding that people feel a way about a system or feel a way about data really helps you be able to interpret that data, especially with the educational side of the house that may not see numbers the way I do. And I don't see educational things the way they do. So it really helps that communication piece. Also, this was probably the hardest for me. Start small and scale. I want to tackle everything at once. When I say I want to get 100% KPIs, I want to give Jen 100% KPIs the first week of all contracts. Not possible. So
And say, hang out with Emma and the audit team.
Right.
Let's bring you back down to scale.
that's why I brought Emma or asked her to join this team. So if you notice the member, she's actually one of the members, because I figured audit would kind of keep me in line, make sure my processes were documented. All right, next step. So we talked about taking this work out into the school-based contracts. And then really just talking and when working with different departments or schools, instilling that mindset that improvement does start with measuring. So can't improve things that we don't measure. So, and then using QOC practices whenever appropriate. So looking at things when talking about these return on investment topics, it's really been a good segue to talk about QI as well, because trying to measure that return on investment, if something's not properly set up to be measured, there's a QI opportunity. So just making sure to keep those practices going. And then right now, I would say our project is at a 7. So we've seen significant improvement. Until we tackle the contracts at the schools, I don't want to put us at sustained improvement, just because that's only half the battle.
Right.
That would be conclude the quality improvement section for me. Question?
Again, I think KPI is an area that we have really invested some time and effort into doing and putting folks in more aligned with understanding it. I think it also gets this to that mentality where folks are thinking about it when they're deciding what resources we're looking for, as opposed to thinking about it after we've already got a vendor, right? So if we're looking at getting someone to do ELL services, okay, what are we actually wanting them to accomplish with our students is a KPI that we need to be thinking about in that process. So getting them to that stage of thinking about it on all levels is a great place to be headed towards.
This is where we get taken advantage of our partnership with Children's Hospital, who actually teaches the tools. So we have 5 people in the department that have been trained, and I have 2 more that were just accepted for this year. I usually get 1 or 2 seats a year, so it takes a while to build up. But they're all coaching each other. In fact, Mike is now one of the coaches that they lean on.
Good job, Mike.
So, and Cody will be next because he's they've really taken the data and just the tools and run with them. Thank you. Thank you, Children's Hospital.
Thank you. All righty. So kind of keeping us going through, I think the next thing on the agenda was the investment report. Back to Kev.
Yes, which this one should be pretty quick. We've been kind of getting in the cadence of doing this about every 6 months. Just to kind of show what the interest revenue has been. It's actually been, one of the things at the bottom of this chart is just to give a historical perspective of what a 5-year treasury bond rate has been over that 5 years. And you can see as COVID happened, it was a lot lower and obviously has continued to go up. So the key point of that is the things that we have in long-term investments that Red Tree manages for us, depending on, maturity dates and that kind of thing, is going to impact our interest revenue. But again, just to kind of give you some perspective of where the market has been. For fiscal year 24, our general fund interest revenue was 4.7 million, which is great. I mean,
That's why we call him Warlock.
That's one of the things, a very positive thing. That has come for the district. I did note there about $1 million of that related to the tax anticipation note borrowing that we did. We were able to hold most of those proceeds and get a return from Star Ohio to basically net off what the cost of that issuance was. But the 4.7 does include that $1 million as well.
You can actually see the impact of COVID very clearly here, where we were earning 4 million and then it just dropped. So the whole market dropped.
Yeah. And then we also show what the debt service fund interest is there. And as the sinking funds are growing, plus with this impact as well, you can see an increase there. The next slide is just a summary of our bank reconciliation, which I think is good just to kind of get in front of you guys to see. It gives a percentage of what we have in our operating accounts, what's managed in the investment portfolio, which is over half of the district's funds. At that point, at the end of June, we had 30% of our dollars in Star Ohio investments and other securities. So again, just we always point out here, this is not just general fund, that there's money that we are holding in internal service fund that's going to be used to pay, health insurance, those kind of things. But it is part of our operation, and I think it's good to kind of get that in front of you. The next page, so this part is an annual requirement that if the district invests, or any government entity invests in commercial paper or bankers acceptance securities, there's a reporting requirement to the state. And Red Tree handles all of that for us. And part of that is behind this is a detailed report of what the district had in commercial paper as well as the purchases that they made there. And so we'll put this on the treasurer's report for the next meeting. And then we'll get that submitted to Ohio Auditor of State and Department of Education before the end of the month.
No.
And that's one more compliance duty that we will have met.
Always good.
Thank you.
All righty. Any questions on that? Seeing none. So the next couple of topics on the agenda are things that the treasurer and I thought would be helpful topics for us to kind of go through and talk about, because they do affect our future budgets significantly. So the first is looking at kind of our long-term financial planning, thinking about how we are going to plan out for future levies as well as other funding mechanisms that we would use or need.
Right. So this is the beginning and it's very draft, but it's the beginning of a long-term planning tool that I'm trying to create. One that builds off of the 5-year forecast. And then so you can see the general operations is from the 5-year forecast on what we've forecasted our expenses to be. It starts off with beginning year cash. Then you subtract out your expenses, add your revenues in. And then, so you can see how your cash balance changes. So what I've done is I've talked to Chris Burkhart who's over the facility repair plan, the curriculum department over their adoption cycle, and CIO Jeremy Gollihue for the technology, the capital payments that we make. And so what the next step I have to do, and you can see that they actually have 5-year cycles spent out or planned out. What I need to figure out is how much of those are already represented in the general operations spending, because we already have the curriculum and the technology payments in there. None of the facility repair stuff is in that general fund money. So that's the next step I have to do, because I don't want to duplicate those expenses. But then the bottom section shows what our forecasted revenue, general fund revenues are. So it'll help us see that, like, in 27 is when the fiscal year 27 is when that renewal cash flows. It's a half a year. So we'll be on the ballot in 26. So it gives us an opportunity to look forward into the future to see, well, if we're going to fund this facility repair plan, we obviously don't have general fund cash to do so. So we need another funding mechanism. Then we have the conversation, is that a PI levy, a bond levy, a borrowing of some kind? And then we'll bring in bond counsel and our financial advisor to help us with those conversations. But I'm trying to, it's the 5-year forecast only looks at general operations and general fund cash. I'm trying to look more holistically about what our long-term plans are. And then as the ad hoc data starts coming in and we start planning and get more specific future out, we can figure out how that plays into this tool. So I just want to have a tool in place so I can drop numbers in and we can have a conversation.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Questions?
So, and I want to kind of reiterate on this, the part of the reason for having this conversation is we already know we have at least one levy that we're going to have to make a hard decision as to what we're going to, not hard, but make a decision as to what we have to do with regard to that. And I think one of the things we also know, our newest board member wasn't part of the conversation, but the other members that are here were part of the conversation around our facilities and really the need to do a new facilities master plan in some way or form, fashion to address our facilities needs. We cannot do those things under what we are currently getting from our state and in our share of revenue from our local levies, right? Like we just know that those things are not a budgetary thing that we can just simply add on $40 million to what we spend every year. So thinking about a plan, which is, I'm thankful for the treasurer putting together kind of a starting point of identifying when things would need to be taken care of and addressed, gets us to start thinking about how we want to do so, what's the proper way to do so. Because the other part is, we know adding another levy can be a lift. We know adding debt comes with its cost as well. And so it's a more intelligent conversation around which options work and don't.
Well, and we're also subject to debt limitations. So
Yep.
we have to make sure that the math works. And we have paid down significantly. I think we're about more than halfway paid down on the FMP debt, $480 million bond levy. So we may have some room there, particularly because our property values went up, which helps us there, but hurts us in other areas.
Yep.
And so it's it's very complex, very complicated. And then we should start talking soon about what we want to do with that levy, because we can change the value and the length. With this levy has a little bit more freedom and change than the other two fixed sum levies, because they were adopted prior to 2013, where the law changed. So this levy does not have those extra rollbacks and the homestead credits. So the rule is if we take one of the older fixed sum levies and change it, you lose those benefits. So the change of the impact is to the homeowner, not to us. And so what we want to do is not make it worse for our taxpayers. So, but this particular levy doesn't have those benefits because it was adopted in 2016. And so we have a little bit more flexibility in changing the size and the length without a negative impact to our taxpayers.
So you just touched on exactly where I was gonna go, with the regard to the levy, but I want to ask my other question first around IT. What is the, there's a significant cost with technology payment increase from 26 to 27. What is that reason? It goes from 13.5 to 17.8.
I don't know specifically. We'll have to ask Jeremy that, but I suspect that something we did 5 years ago is now ending. And then when you have to renew it, it's more costly because technologies.
Okay.
But we can ask Jeremy for specifics.
I'd love to get a little bit more specifics, considering I'm sensitive around the technology for the kids.
Sure.
And staff. So, and then with regard to the facilities, kind of does the same thing. It goes from 33 to 30 down and then to 34. So I just want to understand, what are we just, we're fixing some buildings and then we're not, like, what is the
There is a very detailed plan behind his numbers. If you recall, I think in one of our, what do we call it? Fact finding, thank you. He actually walked through some of that. And then, so what I asked him to do is just update it based on the economics now, because things are more costly than they were then when they did it. But so at next finance committee, we can actually have him come in and, if it's pleasure as the superintendent, for him to come in and look at and show you the data, the different data. But he has it organized by roofs, by HVAC, by plumbing,
okay,
everything. And it's just a part of the cycle
sure,
of which schools pop in when.
that would be great. But I do remember that, we like really can't ask very many questions at the
Yes.
fact finding, but we can have tons of questions in the budget, so that'd be great.
We have a limit on questions here too.
I'm gonna ask.
We have a time limit
questions,
here.
but, so regardless, I'm gonna ask my questions, but the other thing I want to ask is around the levy timeline. So the community doesn't understand that we have multiple levies. They just look at it like you're asking for money again. So, and then we've extended the timeline on several. So they were 5 years. Now there are a few of them are 10
2 or 10 years.
10 years. So can you tell me, this upcoming levy has the preschool promise included? That is one where
It's a
you
preschool expansion that's
Preschool
shared by 2 organizations.
Yeah.
Yes.
that is the definition of that.
Yes.
Thank you. But I want to understand, is this a levy that we could extend the time for and increase the amount
Yes.
and it be considered a renewal? If
Yes.
Okay, so those are the decisions that you're saying we need to make
Mhm.
as a board, right? And just publicly, because I know the answer, but we are spending a significant amount of money for preschool, and it is anticipated that we will need more money because our numbers are going up.
Right. So this year's budget combined is over $20 million. The set aside is 15 million. So the extra 5 million, we're using prior year's unspent cash from that levy specifically. But that money's gonna get spent through by the end of 26 or early 27. So we're either going to, I won't be able to certify a whole year unless we pass that levy. We're either gonna have to scale back or find an alternate funding source.
An alternate funding source could be defined as increasing that levy or no?
Increasing that levy or another grant or something.
Something to bring in more money.
Yeah.
How much, well, those are the discussions that I think we need to have. It's like, realistically speaking, the timeline piece, increasing it over 10 years is simpler to understand. But how much more would we need to write that levy for?
So we would probably need to talk about what that 10-year preschool expansion looks like in order to estimate how much we need.
And that would just be for the preschool side of the levy, because that levy also goes to the district as well. So.
Correct. It's a $48 million levy. 15 is set aside for preschool expansion and the rest was set aside for strategic operations.
And so when we talk about those discussions, would we talk about just the preschool side or just the
The whole,
entire-
all of it. Because, part of our strategy or strategic talking is about expanding career, tech expansion, the ad hoc plan, and what programming would come with that would come out of general funds. You would not borrow for programming operations. So we'd have to make room in our general fund budget to pay for those things if we don't stop doing something else,
Correct.
right?
Gotcha.
Remember my water bottle analogy?
I got you.
So, so that's the whole, conversation we need to have about what do we want to accomplish? And then if we're going to do a 5-year levy, what do we want to accomplish in that 5 years operationally so that we can make sure that we have the appropriate size of funds to do that? Typically, we start with that conversation and the board gets to press at the size of the millage that it needs. And so we start scaling back to think, all right, how many mills do we think we can get past? And then what can we do with it? So it's kind of a dual conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
All right, Ben?
Be very quick. I appreciate the desire to get us out here. I appreciate everybody else. But you can't ignore huge 8 years. All of this.
So we're in fiscal year 25 now. So in November of 26. No, November of 25, we go onto the ballot because it ends the following calendar year.
And so I'm trying to get the moving parts straight. There's the November 25 vote, which could be on another 5 years as is, 10 years as is, 5 years with increase, 10-year with increase, and then totally separate from that, there could be this idea of asking for a bond, which would.
Or a PI levy, yes. Permanent improvement, for those who don't know PI, I'm talking acronyms,
Yep.
but yes,
Thank you.
you're right. November 25 is when we back on the ballot.
Awesome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Alrighty. And again, I think part of what we are recognizing and appreciating is the fact that we have a limited sort of funds. And we also have to be mindful that anything new, like anytime we do new, improvement on a building or whatever we might do, it's going to cost more each additional year because it's just the reality that things cost more. Unfortunately, we don't get deflation too often when it comes to doing our services. I want to keep us moving along though, because this actually taps into the next topic, which is getting us ahead of our budgetary conversations for next year. And so just want to tap into thinking about a budget calendar. I thank Treasurer for putting together kind of a map out of it. You want to just walk through really quickly?
Yeah, so what I did is just very high level, like monthly milestones. If we start in August, which is this conversation about, who, what, when, and where. And then I added a column for public engagement strategy for us to fill out together because it used to be our public engagement was the board meeting presentations and people would come and Barry Cholak and Jim Barry would come and speak. But as we do the financial town halls and then we can do other kinds of engagement that our partner in communications and superintendent side of the house can help with. So I just left that blank for us to fill in together as what would work at each point. And then I try to put in like who would be involved in what's the level of step. But typically we want to start with the board about what is the strategy for next year? What do we want to invest our money in or disinvest our money in, to make up a word. And then the budget task force has agreed to get back together to talk about how can we do the budget cycle differently? Because what happens is we do student projections, we have the staffing formulas defined by the CBAs, the collective bargaining agreements. We build the school budgets, and then there's like a very little pot left for central office. So we're continuing to shrink central office to the point where we're unable to provide good quality services. And that's going to continue to go because our costs are always going to go up at the school level, with step increases and cost of living increases and just general inflation, which puts more and more pressure for central office to decline or to get smaller. And so we can't continue to fund business the way we're doing it or central office is gonna crash and burn eventually. So, Budget Task Force 2 is gonna get together and kind of re-envision how we might do this differently. At the same time, the board's working on the strategies of, what strategic operations we want to increase, grow, decline, whatever. And then we put those together and get moving.
One of the things that the treasurer and I talked about is recognizing that we have to think about this differently as a board than looking at line item by line item, right? Like, so we have to give them guidance to say, hey, these are what the board priorities are, to allow the treasurer and the superintendent to really be able to say, okay, this is what we can do. Let me bring you back these recommendations based on what you identified as the strategies that will work, or the strategies that you want to look out for. And I think that's something we sort of kind of did. I know, Treasurer, you kind of worked with the past superintendent on a process at one point where we try to identify specific areas of that were priorities or that we were trying to do. But I think maybe in this cycle, we as a committee can start the conversation, but the larger board can start to think about if our true recognition is that we've got certain programs that we want to expand or think about, okay, well then what are we willing to give up to get that? Or what are we saying prioritize from the administration, and then allow the administration and the treasurer's office to really be able to bring back those strategies and solutions and ideas, because I think that is one of the things we started to do. Because to use Jen's wonderful analogy, you know, you have a water bottle and it's already kind of full here now, and now we're probably actually like rolling over with little trickles of water down the side. But to add anything more is just going to overflow, and it's not
So
space.
I do want to point out a big milestone is December, when we are committed to putting the staffing information out in the schools. Delaying that into the new year caused huge chaos out in the schools, and that was very unfortunate. So in order to get staffing right at the schools, we have to know what's being redistricted, what schools are changing and merging, and so they can make informed decisions about surplusing and retirement and growth. And so that's an area that we really need to recommit to, is to make sure that we have the baseline staffing out there in the schools.
The other point to this, and I think this really goes towards the superintendent side, is that I think, you know, quite honestly, having a plan of operations that we can build on so that everybody's aware of those opportunities and options also allows us to inform the public a little bit more consistently on what's happening next, right? We know that that's been a other part of the struggle, is that everybody's kind of asking, where does this happen next? And it's like, if we know what we can budget for, if we know what we can start to think about and plan out and build on, when we get to February, March, it's really like, okay, so now that we've done these things and we've done the hard lift as a board to get the guidance and to make those directions, that we can pass a budget on time. Because we've only done that once since I've been on the board. I'd like us to do it at least twice. So
Me too.
So this is again, draft of the calendar. I think it's also an opportunity for us to, or timeline. It's an opportunity for us to also start building in the public engagement strategy, again, working with and understanding the resources. So we make sure we don't overwhelm folks at different times in the year as well. Any other additional thoughts or comments on? All righty. One of the things that the treasurer did, and it's in a great, or the treasurer's team did, and is it already posted, or
What?
The whiteboard?
Oh, I totally forgot about it again. Goodness. Thank you. Rob, did you get the link? Were they able to share that link with you? Yes, please. So, so let me introduce it. So, you know, we did a whiteboard, got a lot of great feedback on it. And then it took me a while to get this one written, but it's how does school budgets build? Like, have you ever wondered how a school budget, like a parent, have you ever wondered how your school gets funded? And so, Parker, I missed Parker already.
Shout out to Parker.
He takes my very busy, lot of math, a lot of data and stuff like that script and puts it into something a parent can understand or a community member can understand. And then he sends it off to create this beautiful video. So there you go.
Feel like we should dim the lights or something, but I'm not asking.
Let's take a look at how they figure it out with a system called student-based budgeting. Every fall, the process starts with a report that counts how many students are in each school. This report also notes special characteristics like if a student has a disability, is learning English, or is gifted. This data is crucial. This information helps the schools predict how many students they'll have next year by looking at the past 3 years' trends. Once these predictions are made, they're shared with each school. This allows schools to make changes based on any special information they know about their students. Next, these student numbers help figure out how many teachers and staff each school needs. This includes classroom teachers, paraprofessionals, counselors, social workers, security staff, clerical support, and assistant principals. Schools also get to decide how many physical education, art, and music teachers they need, but they must have a mix of all three. The budget for staff is based on average salaries, plus extra costs called fringe benefits. These amounts are updated each year to reflect salary increases, cost of living adjustments, and other changes. The fringe benefits, things like retirement, insurance, and workers' comp, are set at 35% of salaries and wages. Next, CPS calculates the non-personnel budget. This is done by multiplying a per pupil amount by the number of projected students. Each school's instructional leadership team then decides how to spend this money on things like supplies and field trips. Finally, each school's budget includes extra money for specific costs like copy and printing, clerical overtime, substitute teachers, and stipends for teachers in charge when there's no assistant principal. Let's look at an example of a neighborhood elementary school. According to its projected enrollment for the upcoming school year, the school will be receiving 589 students, with an additional 14 in need of a self-contained classroom environment. This enrollment number directly correlates to the number of staff required. Looking at this example, we see this school is in need of $6,390,074 worth of required staff. Next, let's look at the non-personnel line items. This includes things like printing, and for this school, that would be $47,034. This, in addition to subs and clerical overtime, adds up to a total general fund budget of $6,532,173.61, which is about $10,832.79 per student. Once the general fund budget is determined, we can start building budgets using state and federal grants for additional supplemental costs, which we'll dive deeper into at a later time. High school budgets are more complex because we must ensure funding aligns with the credits each student needs to graduate. High schools also receive similar non-personnel allocations based on their projected number of students. The master schedule is built from the subject credits each student needs, so the school knows how many English, algebra, science, and social studies teachers are needed. There are extra allocations for career tech programs and elective courses. You now have a good understanding of how Cincinnati Public Schools and school leaders determine their budgets. While there are additional funds and complexities like Title I allocations, student activity funds, and other grants, you now have the essential knowledge to see how your local schools are funded. Understanding this process helps us appreciate the careful planning and resources that go into providing quality education for every student.
What do you think?
Great video.
Yeah, I think they posted it on the website already. Yeah. Well, Parker and I did that. I did the script and he helped, you know. He left. He went to take the chief comms officer for Milford because Krista, thank you, went back to corporate world.
It's a loss.
A huge loss. I cried.
So again, to show we have some really talented people working in our district, and as much as we can and as much as we want to be able to hold them and never let them go ever, we can't always, but that means we just need to keep bringing up more and more great people through the ranks. But Want to say again, these whiteboards are amazing. I keep trying to get people at UC to let me do one, and they never will. But they also show the complexity of these topics in a way that it doesn't feel as complex. So I think it's great.
Yeah, and Parker just takes the complexity and simplifies it for me, because I just keep going into the weeds, right? But so I think we're gonna try to follow it up with how we do our state and federal grants and how that gets supplemented. That'll be even harder to do, but we'll see.
Any other quick comments on this?
Whiteboard or just?
The whiteboard.
Great job, great job.
Awesome. All right. So the last major topic for us to cover is just we have the future sessions of Just Ask Jen coming up. I think a couple of them already been identified as for the first 3, I believe, but we certainly want to make sure that folks are thinking about and submitting additional topics, additional ideas, and also identifying as board members who would like to attend and join Jen on stage. These are always a lot of fun to do. There's great questions that come in from the public. This is something that Treasurer and Dr. Moffitt strategized around and put together, and it's been a great thing that we've been recognized for with other across the country for the work that has been done with this. But it's again that time of year to start putting together ideas and topics, and so some have already been suggested, and I think it's on the list that Jen has there.
And we actually added a button onto the district website under the financial page so that people can submit topics if they would like to. So we'll take it from there, but these are the ideas, and I thought maybe we would just talk about the first 3 topics today is to or do these make sense? We'd like to unveil the whiteboard for the first one, because it's like school starting and everybody's kind of trying to understand. And then we thought the role of the treasurer, since
we can't keep Jen for forever.
right, so I guess a more formal announcement will be coming about change. And then in November just is really start focusing on public engagement around the levy. So does that sound like a good order? Other suggestions?
You said November for the levy?
Because it'll be a year in advance, so.
Yeah, I think as much as we can educate people on everything, why we need it, for sure. Yes, that,
Okay.
I mean, I think we can have a little snippet about that every single time, because people need to understand. And just maybe, I'm thinking growth, but, you know, something around if we were to get more students, what impact does that have so that people understand? We want more students, but that has a cost. So
would you like to do November is more about school funding and those kinds of conversations, and then push the levy conversation until the third? Remember, it's only an hour, so we can only do 5 or 6 slides and then invite the conversation. So I don't want to. Does that sound fair? Okay.
I'm here for everyone, so it doesn't matter.
So again, folks, please go onto the financials tab there or part of the website and click on the button to submit your ideas as well, because we love public input on those ideas. Again, we have a few of them listed, but if there are other creative ideas, we always are open to it. We've done stuff like had operations come in and talk about some of the facility needs and that kind of deal. It was a great presentation from Chris Burkhart when he did that, and talked about some of the cost needs and how we were budgeting for it and planning for it and thinking about it. But so I wanted to also just, again, this is my fault in doing this, but I just wanted to highlight that the additional topics that are at the bottom are related for future meetings. So we're going to strive to have the beginnings of the budget conversation on the next meeting as well. We've invited in the past both CPP and ABC to come through and just talk about what they're doing, showing off that they're doing great things with the resources that are being provided to them. And so I thought, again, we can invite them back in September. If not September, we can figure out what date works for them to come in and just present and tell us what they've been doing. Tell us all the great stuff that, you know, all these wonderful dollars that our local taxpayers are paying for and going towards. And especially, again, I think for both of those organizations, there is such a tight connection to the work that we have done on the board in the past. And so we'll do that as well. We have the TIF and CRAs that we will always do with the annual updates. Since Board Member Lindy was slightly delayed in getting in. I wanted to give him an opportunity also to ask any questions about the budget update. If you had any today that you wanted to pose.
Oh, I apologize for running behind. If you talk
Sorry,
about
Michael.
this.
I apologize for running behind. If you already talked about this, I can just, get the notes or watch the recording. But Treasurer Wagner, you updated us that there was a revenue shortfall in the state budget based on recalculated wealth index. And I was curious if it was, did this topic come up in this meeting today earlier?
No, it has not come up.
Okay.
But yes, our state share dropped from 42% on the dollar to 36.9%, which represents about $15-16 million of revenue. Kevin's going through and doing an analysis, but the reason that state share dropped is because of the triennial update on property values. The 3-year average increased significantly.
Yeah.
And by a couple $2 billion. So we just became, according to the state, much wealthier than the rest of the state.
We're also going to get more property taxes locally because of that, right? In future years?
No, not necessarily. So the fixed sum levies don't change regardless of what happens to property taxes.
I understand that part,
Yes.
but the other ones.
The other ones will only increase with new construction. So we don't, House Bill 920 prevents our property taxes from growing with inflation or with values, right? So only new values. Now, we did get a bump with the 20, because we hit the 20 mil floor on the current expense levies and went below 20 mils. And so we do get that bump back up. So this is like. all these moving parts.
Headline though is like
Yes.
it punches a big hole or like a meaningfully sized hole in some of the revenue that we were expecting.
Yes.
Right.
And so we're analyzing it. We think some of it will be offset because we expanded the number of Title I schools. So our economics data will go up. It'll help offset that loss. But it depends on what the rest of the state is doing because everything is relative to the rest of the state. So we could get richer and everybody else could get poor and we get big richer. Or we could stay the same and everybody else in the district gets poor, so it makes us richer. It's just, it's a very bizarre formula.
Yeah.
On wealth and, it's part of the state funding formula that people still challenge as being unfair.
We can also talk about this at a future meeting. I don't
Yes.
delay us. I think the question I would like us to address at some point is if there isn't going to be additional revenue, then it sounds like we need to cut costs.
Correct.
So what is the plan for how we do that? And
Yes.
again, doesn't need to be today, but happy to do this at a future meeting.
We want to make sure that we're pretty good on what we think that value will be so that we don't overdo. And so our first priority is closing this budget, is putting that one to bed. And then Kevin's working on that, working through with our forecast and the state data to see what the real impact is going to be. But I just felt compelled to make sure everybody was aware that that was a significant change in our estimates.
The one other thing not on the agenda, I want to make sure that everybody knows that we'll be discussing probably in the next meeting as well is the initiation of the RFP for the treasurer search. So we'll be looking at that and bringing it up to the full board's attention as well, so that we can get that process started because Jen again refuses to stay for forever. So we're gonna have to some point replace her. The other thing that again, as we think about additional topics that are issues that may come up, is feel free to just send emails my way if there are additional things that we need to cover or one more clarification on for future committee meetings. It's my understanding there is no comments online. I know Michelle had her hand up earlier, so give Michelle a little time there to give a.
Federation of Teachers. Cincinnati Federation of Teachers, my light is now on. I just want to make a comment about the EdChoice voucher expansion. We know it's reportedly has exploded, up to 60,000 awarded across Ohio. Every student is now eligible for a voucher with no income limits. My question just is that, are there plans about forecasting for that impact for us at CPS? And also, how do we plan to protect against, there's a flood of marketing of our competitors in this market for children. And, we know the data shows that the testing scores are not better. And in fact, in many cases, worse than CPS test scores when you compare it to parochials and charters. I just want to know if there's going to be some proactive messaging, marketing, promotions about, because it's everywhere. It's billboards, it's bus wraps, metro buses driving by. So this is a competitive market, let's be honest about our children. We're proud of what we offer at Cincinnati Public. And so that's my comment. Thank you.
All righty. And again, I think we all recognize that a version of a compromise, I guess is a legit the way to say it, is a version of a compromise was done to restructure somewhat of the formula, but that opened up opportunities for other competitors within the state to make decisions around trying to poach our wonderful students. And again, it's always a struggle, right? It's always going to be our struggle, but really quick. Yes.
So I have a question. Thank you for giving me the time. Do we know the number, to Ms. Dunn's point, the number of students that return to us? In the year would be a great number to have, that start at a school utilizing vouchers and then return to CPS. It would be really, really good if we could get some data around that and have Jen perhaps even do a financial piece around the cost and when we get the money for the students. And that's the one thing that the community doesn't seem to understand very clearly, is that yes, you can utilize a voucher, but when you need additional services that that particular school cannot provide for whatever the reason, and they do return back to Cincinnati Public, there's a cost associated with that. So the dollars follow the student, but what is the cost and what the district has to encumber for that? So
Only 36 cents follows the student.
so it would be really nice if we could do a topic around that, maybe in collaboration with the interim superintendent Murphy, to say, this is the number of students who have utilized vouchers, left our district. These are the number of students that have come back to our district, maybe over 1 or 2 year period. And then what the cost is. The district has to have, we pay for that, for those specialized services. So it would be really great to get that data prior to a levy so that we can talk to the community about what the cost of vouchers is actually costing us if they choose to utilize that, and then what the district has to encompass.
And again, always the struggle in the conversation is that students, we don't know the enrollment until they're here. And so we always look at the continuing growth. But the fun parts are those students who start somewhere else, spend 2 months there, 3 months there, come back to the district, and we have to pay for the rest of the cost. And so that's a conversation point that we always need to make sure that folks understand, is that not every dollar that should be funded towards public schools for students who spend a semester at another district get to us. So it's a great topic for us.
Right. So just in general, if we get about $4,000 per students from the state, we would only get half of that. So $2,000 for that year. But that student coming back may trigger another teacher. So it might cost us $40,000 because we're paying for a half of a year a teacher, but we're only getting $2,000. So that makes a greater pressure on the property tax side of our revenue.
All righty.
That needs to be known and needs to be shown.
It's a good point.
We need to get that. And I would love to have it in a whiteboard, specifically as a Just Ask Jen topic, but I think that's a collaborative effort.
We're gonna have to hire some people to do that.
Yes.
So, well, with no other topics on the agenda, I want to just wish all of our wonderful students, teachers, staff, central office, great start of the year. I know it's been a few days in now, and hopefully everybody is just humming away, doing great things. So, do I have a motion to